The dust swirled around Martha Lawson's boots as she stumbled off the stagecoach, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. Fort Benton, Montana Territory, 1876, the last place she'd ever expected to find herself, and yet here she was, 7 months pregnant and completely alone. The journey had been brutal, but not as brutal as staying in Chicago would have been after everything that had happened. The bustling Missouri River port town was alive with activity. Trappers, traders, cowboys, and riverboat men moved through the dusty streets with purpose. Fort Benton was the innermost port in the United States, the gateway to the Montana gold fields and the last civilized outpost before the untamed wilderness. Martha tried to steady her breathing as she scanned the street for the boarding house she'd been told about. "Need some help with that, madam?" The deep voice startled her. She turned to see a tall man in trail-worn clothes, his face partially obscured by the brim of his Stetson, but she could make out kind eyes and a strong jawline softened by several days' worth of stubble. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied stiffly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide her condition. Though at 7 months along, there was little hiding to be done. The man's eyes flickered briefly to her belly but returned to her face without judgment. "Fort Benton can be overwhelming for newcomers. I'm Keith Collins. I work at the Diamond D Ranch just outside of town." Martha hesitated. Her mother had always told her never to trust a man too quick to offer help, but there was something in his eyes that didn't set off the alarms that had been ringing in her head for months now. "Martha Lawson," she finally replied. "I'm looking for Mrs. Holloway's boarding house." "You're in luck. I'm headed that direction myself. May I?" He gestured to her satchel, and after a moment's hesitation, she relinquished it. They walked in silence through the busy street, Martha keenly aware of the glances thrown her way. A visibly pregnant woman without a wedding ring was a walking scandal in any town, let alone one as small as Fort Benton. "Are you planning to stay long?" Keith asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "As long as I need to," Martha replied cryptically. She had no plans beyond giving birth somewhere far from Chicago, somewhere Edward and his family couldn't find her. Keith didn't press. When they reached the boarding house, a modest 2-story building with peeling white paint and neat curtains in the windows, he handed her the satchel. "Mrs. Holloway is strict but fair," he said. "If you need anything." He trailed off, seeming to reconsider. "Well, folks around here look after one another." Martha nodded her thanks, though she doubted she'd see this cowboy again. She had learned the hard way that kindness often came with conditions. Mrs. Holloway was indeed strict. The older woman's eyes narrowed at Martha's condition. But the letter of recommendation from the pastor's wife back in Chicago, and the 3 months' rent paid in advance, seemed to overcome her initial reservations. "No men in the rooms, no coming in after 9, and no trouble," Mrs. Holloway stated firmly, handing Martha a key. "You got a husband coming to join you?" Martha's hand instinctively went to her stomach. "No, madam, it's just me." The older woman's lips tightened, but she nodded. "Room at the top of the stairs, end of the hall. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 5. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the street. Martha set down her satchel and sank onto the bed, exhaustion overtaking her. The baby kicked, a reminder of the life growing inside her, the reason she had fled Chicago, the reason she had to be stronger than she'd ever been before. As twilight descended on Fort Benton, Martha allowed herself to cry for the first time since boarding the train in Chicago. She cried for the life she'd left behind, for the foolish girl who had believed Edward's promises, for the baby who would be born a bastard in a harsh world. When the tears finally stopped, she made herself a promise. Whatever it took, she would build a life here for herself and for her child. The following morning, Martha woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from downstairs. She dressed quickly in one of the 2 maternity dresses she owned and made her way to the dining room. 3 other boarders, a schoolteacher, a clerk from the general store, and an elderly widow glanced up as she entered but quickly returned to their meals. Martha ate in silence, ignoring the occasional curious glances. After breakfast, she ventured into town, determined to find work. She had enough money to last a few months, but she needed something more permanent. The first 4 businesses she approached: the general store, the milliner's shop, the hotel, and the telegraph office, all turned her away with variations of the same excuse. They couldn't hire a woman in her condition, and certainly not one without a husband. Discouraged but not defeated, Martha tried the town's only restaurant. The owner, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Bailey, looked her up and down with shrewd eyes. "Can you cook?" she asked bluntly. "Yes, madam," Martha replied, "and I can wait tables until I'm too big." Mrs. Bailey nodded slowly. "I need help mornings and noon rush. 5 days a week, pays not much, but you get a meal each shift." Relief washed over Martha. "When can I start?" "Tomorrow, 6 o'clock sharp." As Martha left the restaurant, a commotion down the street caught her attention. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, their horses kicking up dust as they made their way toward the saloon. Among them, she recognized Keith Collins, his hat pushed back on his head as he laughed at something one of his companions said. He caught sight of her and raised his hand in greeting. Martha nodded in acknowledgement before turning away, reminding herself that getting involved with another man was the last thing she needed. For the next month, Martha settled into a routine. She rose before dawn, worked at Bailey's restaurant until mid-afternoon, then returned to the boarding house where she spent her evenings sewing baby clothes from fabric she'd purchased with her first week wages. Her stomach grew larger, and the baby's movements stronger, daily reminders of what awaited her in less than 2 months. She saw Keith Collins occasionally, sometimes at the restaurant when the ranch hands came to town, sometimes just passing on the street. He always tipped his hat politely, sometimes stopping for a brief conversation. Martha found herself looking forward to these encounters more than she cared to admit. One rainy afternoon in late April, Martha was serving coffee to the few customers who had braved the weather when the door swung open, bringing in a gust of wind and rain. Keith Collins stood in the doorway, water dripping from his hat and coat. "Afternoon, Miss Lawson," he said, taking a seat at a corner table. "Miserable day to be out." Martha brought him coffee without being asked. "What brings you to town in this weather, Mr. Collins?" "Supply run. Ranch needed some things that couldn't wait." He wrapped his hands around the steaming mug. "How are you feeling, if you don't mind my asking?" Martha's hand instinctively went to her belly. "As well as can be expected. The doctor says another month, maybe less." Keith nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You got family coming to help?" Martha's smile faltered. "No, no family." She moved away to serve another customer, but when she returned to refill Keith's coffee, he spoke again, his voice low. "Miss Lawson, I hope you don't find this presumptuous, but some of the ranch hands' wives were asking about you. They'd like to help if you'd allow it. Maybe with some baby things or just being there when the time comes." Martha was stunned into silence. Since arriving in Fort Benton, she'd been treated with polite distance by most of the townspeople, tolerated but not welcomed. The offer of help was unexpected. "That's very kind," she finally managed, "but I wouldn't want to impose." Keith's eyes held her steadily. "It's not an imposition, it's what neighbors do." As April turned to May, the weather warmed and Martha's time grew closer. True to Keith's word, several of the ranch wives visited her at the boarding house, bringing handmade blankets, tiny clothes, and practical advice. Martha, who had steeled herself to face motherhood alone, found herself moved to tears by their kindness. Sarah Jenkins, the blacksmith's wife, insisted on staying with her as her due date approached. "No woman should be alone for this," she said firmly, setting up camp in a chair by Martha's bed. "I've helped birth 5 of my own and 3 of my sisters. You're in good hands." The pains began just after midnight on May 12th. Martha gasped awake, clutching her belly as a contraction tore through her. Sarah was instantly alert, her experienced hands checking Martha's condition. "It's time, honey. I'm going to fetch the doctor." The next 12 hours were a blur of pain, fear, and exhaustion. Dr. Wilson arrived quickly, his manner brusque but competent. Sarah never left Martha's side, wiping her brow, helping her breathe, murmuring encouragement as Martha's body worked to bring new life into the world. "You're doing wonderfully," Sarah assured her as Martha cried out during a particularly brutal contraction. "Almost there now." The sun was high in the sky when Martha gave a final, tremendous push, and her son slid into the world with an indignant wail. "Doctor!" Wilson cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing him in Martha's trembling arms. "You have a healthy boy, Miss Lawson," he announced, packing his instruments. "I'll check in tomorrow." Martha looked down at her son's tiny, red face, his shock of dark hair so like his father's. A wave of love unlike anything she had ever known washed over her, alongside a renewed determination to give him the life he deserved. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered, the name she had chosen months ago finally belonging to a real person. "I'm your mama." As news of Thomas's birth spread through the small community, Martha was surprised by the steady stream of visitors bearing gifts and good wishes. Mrs. Bailey sent over a basket of food with strict instructions for Martha to take 2 weeks before returning to work. Mrs. Holloway, despite her initial disapproval, softened at the sight of the baby and offered to watch him when Martha returned to her job. Keith Collins arrived 3 days after Thomas's birth, looking uncharacteristically nervous as he knocked on Martha's door. He held a small wooden object in his hands. "I heard about the little one," he said, his voice gentle. "Thought he might like this when he's a bit older." It was a beautifully carved wooden horse, obviously made with great care. Martha accepted it, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Would you like to meet him?" she asked, gesturing to the cradle by her bed where Thomas slept. Keith approached the cradle cautiously, as though afraid he might somehow harm the infant just by looking at him. His expression softened as he gazed down at the sleeping baby. "He's perfect," Keith murmured. "You did good, Miss Lawson." Martha smiled, genuine warmth spreading through her for the first time in months. "Thank you, and please call me Martha." "Martha, then," Keith replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "And I'm Keith to my friends." The early weeks of motherhood were exhausting and overwhelming, but Martha found unexpected strength within herself. Thomas was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in decent stretches. Mrs. Holloway proved to be an attentive caregiver when Martha returned to work, her initial reservations about an unwed mother apparently forgotten. Keith began stopping by the restaurant more frequently, always choosing a table in Martha's section. Sometimes he brought small gifts for Thomas, a soft rabbit skin, a tiny pair of moccasins purchased from a passing Native American trader. His interest in the baby seemed genuine, and Martha found herself looking forward to his visits. One evening in late June, Martha was walking back to the boarding house after her shift when Keith rode up beside her. "Evening, Martha," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I walk with you a spell?" Martha nodded, and Keith dismounted, leading his horse beside her. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Keith spoke again. "I've been meaning to ask. There's a social at the church on Saturday. Dancing, food, that sort of thing. I thought you and Thomas might enjoy getting out for a bit." Martha hesitated. She hadn't attended any social function since arriving in Fort Benton, partly because of her pregnancy and partly from fear of judgment. But now, "I don't know, Keith. People talk enough as it is." Keith's expression grew serious. "Martha, I won't pretend there aren't folks who gossip. But there are more who admire how you've made a life here, how you're raising your son with dignity. And those are the ones worth knowing." His words touched something deep within her, a longing for acceptance she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. "All right," she said finally. "We'll come." The social was held in the church meeting hall, decorated with wildflowers and lit with lanterns. Martha wore her best dress, a blue cotton that had been let out during her pregnancy, but now hung a bit loose on her recovering figure. Thomas was bundled against her chest in a sling Sarah Jenkins had shown her how to make. She felt eyes on her as she entered, heard the momentary lull in conversation, but Keith was instantly at her side, a steadying presence. To her surprise, many of the women who had helped after Thomas's birth came forward to greet her, to coo over the baby, to introduce her to their husbands and children. "See, not so bad," Keith murmured as they stood by the refreshment table. "No, not so bad," Martha agreed, watching as Sarah Jenkins gently took Thomas from her arms, insisting that Martha enjoy herself for a few minutes. "Dance with me?" Keith asked, extending his hand as the small band struck up a lively tune. Martha hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. Keith led her onto the floor, his hand warm against the small of her back. He was a surprisingly good dancer, guiding her with confidence through the steps. "Where did a cowboy learn to dance like this?" she asked, slightly breathless. Keith laughed. "My mother insisted all her sons learn, said no girl would marry a man who stepped on her toes." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Keith said, a shadow crossing his face. "Lost her 2 winters ago to pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Martha said softly. "My parents are gone too. Father in the war, mother 5 years ago." Keith nodded in understanding, drawing her slightly closer as the music slowed. Martha could feel the strength in his arms, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. For the first time since discovering she was pregnant, she felt safe. As the summer progressed, Keith became a regular fixture in Martha and Thomas's life. He would stop by the boarding house on his days off, sometimes taking them for rides in a borrowed wagon to the river, or to a pretty spot he knew with wildflowers stretching as far as the eye could see. Thomas grew quickly, his dark eyes taking in the world with increasing awareness, his tiny hands reaching for everything within grasp. Martha found herself sharing more of her past with Keith during these outings, telling him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her move to Chicago after her mother's death, her work as a shop girl in a fashionable department store. She didn't speak of Edward, though, or how she came to be with child and alone. Keith never asked, but Martha sometimes caught him looking at her with questions in his eyes. One warm August evening, they sat by the Missouri River, Thomas sleeping peacefully on a blanket beside them. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, reflected in the slow-moving water. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," Martha said, watching as the colors deepened. "I have," Keith replied quietly, his eyes on her face. Martha felt her cheeks grow warm. "Keith, I know I don't have any right to say this," he continued, his voice low and earnest, "and if you tell me to mind my own business, I will. But these past months, getting to know you and Thomas. Martha, I care for you both, More than I can say. Martha's heart raced. Part of her wanted to reach for him, to let herself fall into whatever he was offering. But the larger part, the part that had been hurt, betrayed, abandoned, held her back. Keith, you're a good man, but you don't know everything about me, about Thomas. I know enough, Keith insisted. I know you're strong and kind and brave. I know you love your son more than anything. The rest, well, we all have pasts, Martha. Thomas stirred on the blanket, whimpering slightly before settling again. Martha reached out to touch his tiny hand, drawing strength from the contact. Thomas's father was a man named Edward Blackburn, she said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. He is the son of one of Chicago's wealthiest men. I met him when he came into the store where I worked. He was charming, educated, everything I thought I wanted. For 3 months he courted me properly, theater outings, walks in the park, always respectable. She paused, gathering herself. Then one night he took me to his family's empty lake house. He had wine, said all the right things, and I believed him when he promised we would marry. Keith's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. When I discovered I was expecting, I went to him, certain he would keep his promise. Instead, he denied everything, said I was trying to trap him, that I'd been with other men, that he would ruin me if I pursued the matter. His father offered me money to disappear, to take care of the problem. I took enough for a train ticket and came west instead. Martha blinked back tears. So now you know. Thomas is the son of a man who wanted him dead before he was even born. Keith reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. No, he said firmly. Thomas is your son, and he's the luckiest boy alive to have you for his mother. Martha searched his face for disgust or judgment, but found only compassion. You don't think less of me, how could I? Keith asked softly. You protected your child at all costs. That's not something to be ashamed of, Martha. That's something to be proud of. Thomas chose that moment to wake fully, his small face screwing up as he began to cry. Martha lifted him, cradling him against her chest as she murmured soothing words. Keith watched them, his expression thoughtful. We should head back, he said finally. It's getting dark. The ride back to town was quiet, Martha lost in thought about the conversation by the river. Keith had taken her confession better than she could have hoped, but what did it mean for them? Was there even a them to consider? As they reached the boarding house, Keith helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment. Martha looked up at him, Thomas nestled between them. Thank you, she said softly, for listening, for not judging. Keith's eyes held hers steadily. Thank you for trusting me. He hesitated, then leaned forward and brushed a gentle kiss against her forehead. Good night, Martha. Good night, little man. Martha watched him drive away, her emotions in turmoil. For so long, she had kept everyone at arm's length, convinced that was the only way to protect herself and Thomas. But Keith had slipped past her defenses, and now she didn't know if she had the strength or even the desire to push him away. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn to Fort Benton. Thomas was 4 months old now, growing stronger every day, his personality beginning to emerge. He had Martha's smile and determination, but his dark eyes and hair were all Edward's, a fact that sometimes caused her heart to clench when she looked at her son. Martha had saved enough from her wages at the restaurant to rent a small cabin on the edge of town, just one room with a cook stove, a bed for her, and a cradle for Thomas, but it was theirs. The sense of achievement she felt upon moving in was unlike anything she had experienced before. Keith helped her move her few belongings, building shelves for her dishes and reinforcing the door against the coming winter winds. He brought a rocking chair he'd traded for at the general store, for when Thomas is fussy, he explained. Though Martha often found herself sitting in it long after her son had fallen asleep, watching the stars through her small window. On a crisp Saturday afternoon in late September, Keith arrived at Martha's cabin with an unexpected invitation. "The boss's wife is having a birthday dinner tonight at the ranch," he explained. "She specifically asked me to bring you and Thomas. Said it's been too long since she's held a baby." Martha hesitated. "I don't know, Keith. I've never met your boss or his wife. What would they think?" "They'd think I'm lucky to know such a fine woman and her son," Keith interrupted gently. "Mrs. Dawson doesn't stand on ceremony, Martha. She's good people." The Diamond D Ranch was a half-hour ride from town, a sprawling operation with a large main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings. As they approached, Martha felt a flutter of nerves. She had dressed Thomas in his best clothes and worn her Sunday dress, but she still feared judgment. Janet Dawson, however, proved to be exactly as Keith had described, a warm, practical woman in her 50s who immediately took Thomas from Martha's arms with practiced ease. "My youngest is 12 now," she explained, nuzzling Thomas's neck as he cooed at her. "I miss these days. Come in. Come in, dinner's almost ready." The Dawson house was comfortable rather than fancy, filled with well-used furniture and mementos from their 30 years in Montana territory. Daniel Dawson, a tall man with weathered features and kind eyes, greeted Martha with genuine hospitality, showing her photographs of their 6 children, 4 of whom had grown and moved away. The dinner was simple but delicious: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and a birthday cake that Janet laughingly admitted had been made by their cook rather than herself. "I can run a ranch and raise 6 children, but I never could bake worth a damn," she confessed, making Martha laugh. Throughout the evening, Martha observed Keith with the Dawsons. It was clear they thought highly of him. Daniel spoke of Keith's skill with horses and his plans to make him foreman next spring, while Janet treated him with the affectionate exasperation of a surrogate mother. As they prepared to leave, Janet pulled Martha aside. "Keith's a good man," she said without preamble. "Best hire we've had in 20 years. He deserves happiness after all he's been through." Martha's curiosity was piqued. "What do you mean?" Janet looked surprised. "He hasn't told you." About his wife and child. Martha felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. "His wife and child? Oh, Lord," Janet murmured. "I thought surely he'd mentioned it by now." "Martha, Keith was married before. His wife Rebecca died in childbirth 5 years ago along with their baby girl. He doesn't speak of it often, hardly ever, in fact." Martha's mind reeled with this new information. Keith, a widower, a father who had lost his child before ever holding her. No wonder he had been so kind to Thomas, so understanding of Martha's situation. On the ride back to town, Martha was uncharacteristically quiet, processing what she had learned. Keith seemed to sense her mood, giving her the space she needed until they were nearly at her cabin. "Was it something Janet said?" he asked finally. "She can be a bit forward sometimes." Martha looked at him in the fading light. "She told me about Rebecca, about your daughter." Keith's hands tightened on the reins. "Ah, I should have told you myself." "Why didn't you?" He was silent for a long moment. "At first it didn't seem relevant. Then, as we grew closer, I don't know. It's not something I talk about easily, even after all this time." "I understand," Martha said softly. "And I'm so sorry, Keith. I can't imagine the pain." Keith guided the wagon to a stop outside her cabin. "For a long time, I thought I'd never feel anything again, that the part of me capable of caring had died with them. Then I met you and Thomas." He turned to look at her, his expression raw with emotion. "You woke something in me I thought was gone forever." Martha reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "I know what you mean. After Edward, I didn't trust anyone, especially not men, but you're nothing like him." Keith's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "Martha, I don't want to rush you. I know you've been hurt and you've got Thomas to think about, but I need you to know how I feel." Martha's heart pounded in her chest. "How do you feel?" "Like I've found my way home after being lost for years." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Martha's eyes. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Keith leaned forward until his lips met hers in a gentle kiss. Martha's free hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. When they parted, Keith rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "But I'll see you tomorrow," Martha nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. She watched as he drove away, touching her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. That night, as Martha nursed Thomas before bed, she allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had resigned herself to, not just her and Thomas against the world, but a family, complete with a man who looked at her son with love rather than resentment. It was a dangerous hope, but for the first time since leaving Chicago, Martha let herself believe it might be possible. October brought harvest time to the farms surrounding Fort Benton and increased activity at the Diamond D as they prepared the herd for winter. Keith's visits became less frequent as his responsibilities at the ranch increased, but when he did come to town, he made a point of spending time with Martha and Thomas. Their relationship progressed slowly, built on mutual respect and growing affection. Keith never presumed, always letting Martha set the pace, understanding her need for caution. For her part, Martha found herself falling deeper for this quiet, steady man who treated her son with such tenderness. Thomas thrived, growing into a happy, curious baby who delighted in exploring his expanding world. He had begun to recognize Keith, his face lighting up whenever the cowboy entered the room. Martha watched their interactions with a mixture of joy and lingering fear, joy at the bond forming between them, fear of allowing Thomas to become attached to a man who might someday leave. One evening in late October, Martha invited Keith to dinner at her cabin. She had prepared a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, splurging on apples for a pie. Thomas, unusually fussy, refused to settle in his cradle, so Martha held him as they ate, apologizing repeatedly for the awkwardness. "Let me try," Keith offered, holding out his arms. Martha hesitated only briefly before passing Thomas to him. Keith cradled the baby against his chest, his large hand supporting Thomas's head with surprising gentleness. "What's got you all worked up tonight, partner?" he murmured, rising to pace slowly around the small cabin. "Your mama made us a fine dinner, and here you are making her eat cold stew." To Martha's amazement, Thomas's cries gradually subsided as Keith continued to talk to him in a low, soothing voice. Within minutes, the baby's eyes were drooping, his small body relaxing into sleep. "How did you do that?" Martha asked in wonder as Keith carefully lowered Thomas into his cradle. Keith shrugged, a touch of sadness crossing his features. "I used to talk to my daughter like that, before she was born. Rebecca said she'd always settle down when she heard my voice." Martha's heart ached for him. "You would have been a wonderful father, Keith." He looked at her for a long moment. "I still could be," he said quietly. The weight of his words hung between them. Martha found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze, her heart racing with both fear and hope. "Thomas has a father," she said softly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Even if Edward wanted nothing to do with him, Keith's expression didn't change. "A father is more than just blood, Martha. It's being there. It's teaching, protecting, loving." Martha thought of Edward, handsome, wealthy, empty of any real substance. Then she looked at Keith, honest, hardworking, his heart so big despite the pain he'd endured. "You really mean that, don't you?" She whispered, I've never meant anything more in my life." Martha crossed the small space between them, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath her fingertips. Keith's hands settled at her waist, drawing her closer. "I'm falling in love with you, Martha Lawson," he confessed, his voice a low rumble. "With both of you." Martha's breath caught. "I think I've been falling in love with you since you carried my satchel to the boarding house." Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with the promise of what could be. Martha felt herself melting into him, all the walls she had built around her heart crumbling under the gentle assault of Keith's touch. A cry from the cradle broke the moment. Martha pulled away reluctantly, her cheeks flushed. "He has impeccable timing," she said with a soft laugh. Keith smiled, releasing her to tend to Thomas. "He's making sure I remember my priorities." As October turned to November, Martha found herself thinking of the approaching holidays with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Her first Christmas with Thomas. Her first Christmas with Keith, if things continued as they were. But also her first Christmas away from everything familiar, in a place where winter could be brutal. Keith spoke of the Diamond Detiquette's Christmas traditions, a big dinner for all the hands, gifts for everyone, music and dancing. "Mrs. Dawson insists everyone's family," he explained. "Says no one should be alone for Christmas." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Martha commented, thinking how different Janet Dawson was from Edward's mother, who had looked at Martha as though she were something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of her expensive shoe. "She wants you and Thomas to come," Keith said, "for Christmas dinner, both of you." The invitation touched Martha deeply. We'd like that. The first snow fell in mid-November, transforming Fort Benton into a winter wonderland. Martha bundled Thomas warmly for his first experience with snow, delighting in his wide-eyed wonder as she held him by the window to watch the white flakes swirl past. Keith arrived that evening with extra firewood and a small sleigh he had borrowed from the Dawsons. "Thought you might like a ride," he suggested. "Thomas, too. We'll bundle him up good." The sleigh ride through the snow-covered countryside was like something from a dream. Thomas, securely nestled between them in multiple blankets, eventually dozed off despite the jingling of the bells on the horse's harness. Martha leaned against Keith's shoulder, feeling a contentment she had never expected to find again. They stopped on a ridge overlooking the Missouri River, the water a dark ribbon winding through the white landscape. Keith wrapped his arm around Martha, drawing her close against the cold. "Pretty, isn't it?" he said, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Beautiful," Martha agreed, watching as the last light of day painted the snow in shades of pink and gold. Keith was quiet for a moment, then spoke hesitantly. "Martha, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Martha looked up at him, noting the serious set of his features. "What is it?" "I know it hasn't been long and I don't want to rush you, but—" He took a deep breath. "The foreman's cabin at the Diamond D will be empty come spring when old Jim retires. Boss is giving it to me with the promotion. It's not much, but it's solid. 3 rooms, a good roof. Room for a family to grow." Martha's heart began to pound as she understood where he was heading. "What I'm trying to say, not very well," Keith continued, turning to face her fully, "is that I love you, Martha. You and Thomas both. And if you'll have me, I want to marry you. To be a husband to you and a father to Thomas." Martha stared at him, tears filling her eyes as emotion welled up inside her. "Keith, are you sure? Thomas isn't, he's yours," Keith interrupted gently. "That's all that matters to me. I'll love him like he's my own blood, because he's a part of you." Martha thought of the past year, the fear, the loneliness, the desperate hope that had brought her to Fort Benton, and then of the unexpected blessing that had found her here in this man who looked at her with such love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Yes, I'll marry you." Keith's face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it took Martha's breath away. He cupped her face in his gloved hands and kissed her, a kiss that held all the promises they had just made to each other. Thomas stirred between them, making a small sound of protest at being slightly squished. They broke apart, laughing, and Keith looked down at the baby with affection. "Sorry, little man," he said softly. "Better get used to it, though. Your mama just agreed to make me the happiest man in Montana Territory." As they drove back to town, Martha realized that for the first time since learning she was pregnant, she was looking forward rather than backward, not just getting through each day, but planning for a future filled with possibilities. The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of preparations. Martha and Keith decided to marry quietly after the new year, with only the Dawsons and a few close friends as witnesses. Janet Dawson insisted on hosting the ceremony at the ranch, declaring it the only proper thing to do for our new foreman and his family. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Fort Benton's small community. Most offered congratulations, though Martha still caught the occasional disapproving glance from some of the town's more traditional matrons. She found, however, that these bothered her far less than before. Keith's love and acceptance had given her a confidence she had never possessed. Christmas at the Diamond D was everything Keith had promised: warm, welcoming, and filled with the kind of genuine good cheer that Martha had thought existed only in storybooks. Thomas, now 7 months old and sitting up on his own, was passed from lap to lap, thoroughly spoiled with attention and small gifts. Janet presented Martha with a beautiful handmade quilt for her and Keith's new home. "Been working on it since October," she admitted. "I had a feeling about you too." Daniel gave Keith several days off after Christmas, allowing him to spend more time in town with Martha and Thomas. They used the time to plan their future, what furniture they would need for the foreman's cabin, how Martha might help with the ranch accounts given her experience working in Chicago, how they would make space for Thomas as he grew. "And maybe for more children someday," Keith suggested tentatively one evening as they sat by the fire in Martha's cabin. "If you wanted." Martha, who had once thought Thomas would be her only child, found herself warming to the idea. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Not right away, but someday." Keith smiled, drawing her closer. "No rush. We've got time." New Year's Day, 1877, dawned clear and cold. Martha woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. Today she would become Mrs. Keith Collins. Today Thomas would gain a father in every way that mattered. Sarah Jenkins arrived to help her prepare, bringing with her a simple but elegant white dress she had altered to fit Martha perfectly. "Every bride deserves something special," she insisted when Martha protested the expense. Thomas, dressed in a new outfit Janet had made for him, seemed to sense the importance of the day, behaving angelically as Martha dressed. Sarah took him while Martha pinned up her hair, weaving a few winter berries into the dark strands as a substitute for flowers. "You look beautiful," Sarah said when Martha was ready. "Keith Collins won't know what hit him." The small gathering at the Diamond D included the Dawsons, Sarah and her husband, Mrs. Bailey from the restaurant, Mrs. Holloway from the boarding house, and several of the ranch hands who had become Keith's friends. The ranch's main room had been decorated with pine boughs and candles, creating a festive atmosphere despite the winter chill outside. Keith waited for her by the fireplace, looking more nervous than Martha had ever seen him. He had trimmed his beard and borrowed a suit from Daniel Dawson, though it hung a bit loose on his leaner frame. When he caught sight of her entering the room with Thomas in her arms, his expression transformed into one of such wonder and love that Martha felt her eyes fill with tears. The local preacher performed a simple ceremony. Keith had insisted on writing his own vows, and Martha's heart swelled as he spoke of his love for her, his promise to cherish her and Thomas for all his days. When it was her turn, Martha handed Thomas to Sarah and took both of Keith's hands in hers. "Keith Collins, you came into my life when I had given up on finding happiness again. You showed me that there are good men in this world, men who keep their promises, men who love without conditions. I promise to be a true wife to you, to stand by you through whatever life brings, to create a home filled with love and laughter. And I promise that Thomas will know every day what a blessing it is to have you for his father." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as they exchanged rings, simple gold bands Keith had ordered from back east. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Keith kissed her with such tenderness that Martha felt her heart might burst with joy. The celebration afterward was lively, but brief winter days were short, and most guests needed to return to town before dark. The Dawsons had insisted that Martha, Keith, and Thomas spend their first night as a family in the main house, moving into the foreman's cabin, once it was properly prepared in the spring. That night, after Thomas had been settled in a cradle Janet had pulled down from the attic, Martha and Keith found themselves truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. Keith drew her into his arms, his touch reverent. "I never thought I'd have this again," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "A family, a future." Martha reached up to touch his face, memorizing every line, every angle. "I never thought I'd have it at all." Their coming together was gentle, unhurried, two people who had found in each other a second chance at happiness, a healing of old wounds, a beginning rather than an end. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath warm blankets, Keith's fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, Martha thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fear and heartbreak of Chicago seemed like another lifetime, another person. "What are you thinking about?" Keith asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Martha smiled, nestling closer to his warmth. "About how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing." "Thomas," Keith said with understanding. "And you," Martha added, "if Edward hadn't been what he was, I never would have come west, never would have found you." Keith was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling on her shoulder. "Martha, there's something I want you to know." She tilted her head to look at him. "What is it?" "Thomas may not have my blood, but he has my heart, completely. From this day forward, he's my son in every way that matters. I'll make sure he grows up knowing what it means to be a good man, knowing he's loved and valued." Martha felt tears threatening again. "Keith Collins, how did I get so lucky?" "I'm the lucky one," he insisted, drawing her into another kiss. Spring came early to Montana territory that year. By mid-March, the snow was melting, revealing the first tentative green shoots beneath. At the Diamond D, preparations were underway for Keith to officially take over as foreman, and for the Collins family to move into their new home. Martha and Janet spent weeks cleaning and preparing the cabin, making curtains, arranging the furniture Keith had built or traded for during the winter. Thomas, now almost 10 months old and crawling everywhere, supervised their efforts with comical seriousness. "He's going to be walking soon," Janet observed as Thomas pulled himself up on a chair, his small face determined. "Keith will have his hands full chasing him around the ranch." Martha smiled, watching her son. "Keith can't wait. He's already talking about teaching him to ride." "And you?" Janet asked perceptively. "How are you finding ranch life?" "I love it," Martha said, realizing as she spoke that it was true. "It's not what I imagined for myself, but now I can't picture anything else." Janet nodded with satisfaction. "You belong here, both of you. Anyone can see that." moving day arrived in early April. The foreman's cabin, situated a short distance from the main house, was larger than Martha's cabin in town had been, with a proper bedroom for her and Keith, a small room for Thomas, and a comfortable living area with a kitchen at one end. Keith had built shelves and cabinets throughout, using his winter evenings productively. "It's perfect," Martha declared as they stood in the doorway, surveying their new home. Thomas, secure in Keith's arms, reached out toward the interior as though eager to explore. "Not quite perfect yet," Keith said mysteriously. "There's one more thing." He led her to the bedroom, where a beautiful wooden sign hung above the bed. Carved into the polished surface were the words Collins Family ESD, 1877, surrounded by intricate scrollwork. "Keith," Martha breathed, running her fingers over the detailed carving. "Did you make this?" He nodded, looking pleased at her reaction. "Worked on it nights in the bunkhouse. Wanted something to make it official." Martha turned to him, her eyes shining. "I love you, Keith Collins." "I love you too, Mrs. Collins," he replied, leaning down to kiss her, careful not to squish Thomas between them. The baby reached out, patting both their faces with his small hands as though blessing their union. Keith laughed, ruffling Thomas's dark hair. "Don't worry, partner. You're still my best boy." Life at the Diamond D settled into a pleasant rhythm. Keith's duties as foreman kept him busy, but he always made time for Martha and Thomas, often taking the baby with him for morning rounds when the weather was good. Martha helped Janet with the household accounts and created a small vegetable garden behind their cabin, determined to contribute to their new life. Thomas took his first proper steps just before his first birthday, toddling unsteadily from Martha to Keith with a look of astonished pride on his small face. Keith scooped him up, tossing him gently in the air until Thomas shrieked with laughter. "That's my boy," Keith exclaimed, his face alight with fatherly pride. "Next thing you know, you'll be riding and roping." Martha watched them together, her heart full. In the year since Thomas's birth, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The scared, pregnant girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Fort Benton seemed like a distant memory. For Thomas's first birthday, Janet insisted on a proper celebration. The ranch hands contributed a hand-carved wooden rocking horse, which Thomas immediately tried to climb. Keith gave him his first hat, a tiny version of his own Stetson, which Thomas wore proudly for approximately 5 minutes before trying to eat it. Martha had sewn him new clothes and a special blanket, but her real gift was a small book in which she had carefully recorded his milestones: first smile, first laugh, first word, mama, first steps. She intended it to be an ongoing record of his life, something he could look back on when he was grown. For when he asks about his beginnings, she explained to Keith that night after Thomas had fallen asleep, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Keith nodded, understanding what she meant. "Someday he'll have questions." "About Edward," Martha said quietly. Keith pulled her close, his steady presence comforting. "When that day comes, we'll tell him the truth. That his birth father couldn't see the blessing in front of him, but that I've thanked God every day for the chance to be his father." Martha leaned against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You're the only father he'll ever know or need." As Thomas grew from baby to toddler, his personality blossomed. He was curious about everything, determined to master any challenge, and fiercely loving to those in his small circle. He adored Keith, following him like a shadow whenever possible, imitating his walk, his gestures, even the way he placed his hat on his head. By the time he was 18 months old, Thomas was calling Keith Papa without any prompting, a development that brought tears to Keith's eyes the first time he heard it. Martha captured the moment in her memory book, along with a small sketch she had made of the two of them together. Life wasn't always perfect. The ranch faced challenges: harsh weather, market fluctuations, the occasional conflict with neighboring operations. Keith's responsibilities as foreman meant long days, sometimes weeks away on cattle drives. Martha learned to be both mother and father during these absences, to run their small household efficiently, to be a part of the larger ranch community. But through it all, their love for each other and for Thomas remained the constant center of their world. Keith never treated Thomas as anything less than his own flesh and blood, and Martha's heart swelled with gratitude every time she watched them together. In the summer of 1878, as Thomas approached his second birthday, Martha discovered she was expecting again. She waited until Keith returned from a cattle drive to share the news, watching his face transform with wonder and joy. "Another baby," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Martha covered his hand with hers. "A brother or sister for Thomas?" Keith's eyes misted slightly. "He's going to be a wonderful big brother." Telling Thomas about the baby required creativity. At just shy of 2, his understanding was limited, but he seemed to grasp that something important was happening. "Baby," he said solemnly, patting Martha's stomach. "Baby coming." "That's right, sweetheart," Martha confirmed. "You're going to be a big brother." Thomas considered this information with the serious expression he wore when processing new ideas. "Baby play with Thomas," Keith laughed, ruffling his son's dark hair. "When the baby gets bigger, yes. And you'll have to help Mama and Papa take care of the baby." Thomas nodded decisively. Thomas help. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and winter. Unlike her experience with Thomas, Martha was surrounded by support: Keith's unwavering presence, Janet's practical advice, the camaraderie of other ranch wives who had been through the same journey. Thomas became increasingly fascinated with the changes in his mother, placing his small hands on her growing belly to feel the baby's movements, talking to his unborn sibling with earnest one-sided conversations that made Martha and Keith exchange amused glances over his head. On a cold February morning in 1879, Martha's labor began. Keith sent one of the ranch hands for the doctor while Janet and Sarah Jenkins came to assist. Thomas was whisked away to the main house, where Daniel Lawson promised to keep him occupied with stories and small tasks. The labor was shorter than with Thomas, but no less intense. Keith stayed by Martha's side throughout, his steady presence giving her strength when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. As dawn broke over the Montana landscape, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that announced her presence to everyone within earshot. "She's perfect," the doctor declared, placing the swaddled infant in Martha's arms. "Congratulations, Mrs. Collins." Martha looked down at their daughter red-faced, indignant at being thrust into the cold world, but undeniably beautiful with a dusting of fair hair unlike Thomas's dark locks. "Hello, Rebecca," she whispered, looking up at Keith. They had decided months ago that if they had a daughter, she would be named for Keith's first wife, a way of honoring the woman who had been part of his journey, just as Thomas was part of Martha's. Keith's eyes filled with tears as he gazed at their daughter. "Rebecca Jane Collins," he said softly, adding Janet's name as they had agreed a tribute to the woman who had been like a mother to both of them. Later that morning, Daniel brought Thomas to meet his sister. The toddler approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide as he peered at the bundle in Martha's arms. "Baby," he asked, his voice hushed. "This is your sister, Rebecca," Martha told him. "Would you like to touch her?" Thomas reached out a tentative finger to stroke the baby's cheek. Rebecca turned toward the touch, her tiny mouth working as though searching for food. Thomas giggled. "Baby hungry," he announced with the authority of an experienced older brother. "She sure is," Keith agreed, lifting Thomas onto the bed so he could see better. "She's going to need her big brother to help take care of her." Thomas nodded seriously. "Thomas, help." Martha watched her family, her husband, her son, her newborn daughter, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. From the darkest moment of her life had come this incredible blessing, this second chance at happiness she had never expected to find. As the children grew, the Collins family became a fixture at the Diamond D. Keith's skill as foreman helped the ranch prosper, and Daniel Lawson increasingly relied on him to manage day-to-day operations as he and Janet began to consider retirement. Thomas, with his dark hair and serious eyes, grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who shadowed Keith everywhere, soaking up knowledge about horses, cattle, and the land like a sponge. By 5, he could ride a gentle pony on his own. By 7, he was helping with small chores around the ranch, his face alight with pride when Keith praised his efforts. Rebecca, fair-haired and blue-eyed like her father, was as different from her brother as day from night, spirited, stubborn, with a laugh that could be heard across the ranch yard. She adored her older brother, following him everywhere, much to Thomas's occasional exasperation and secret pleasure. In the spring of 1884, when Thomas was 8 and Rebecca 5, Daniel Lawson called Keith and Martha to the main house for a serious conversation. The years had aged him, white now heavily streaking his once dark hair, the lines in his face deeper than before. "Janet and I have been talking," he began, his wife nodding beside him. "We're not getting any younger. Our children are scattered from California to New York, none interested in ranching. We've built something good here and we don't want to see it broken up." Keith and Martha exchanged glances, sensing where this was heading. "We want to offer you the chance to buy the ranch," Daniel continued. "Not all at once, we know that would be impossible, but over time, with you running it as your own from the start." Martha felt Keith tense beside her, hope and caution warring in his expression. "That's a generous offer, sir, but the Diamond D is worth more than we could raise in a lifetime." Janet leaned forward. "We're not looking to get rich, Keith. We're looking for the right people to carry on what we've built. You and Martha are those people. We've known it for years." The discussion continued well into the evening. Practical considerations, financial arrangements, living situations. By the time Keith and Martha walked back to their cabin, the outlines of an agreement had been sketched that would eventually make the Diamond D theirs. "Can you believe it?" Keith said as they stood outside their cabin, the Montana night spread in a canopy of stars above them. "Our own ranch." Martha leaned against him, thinking of the frightened, pregnant girl who had arrived in Fort Benton with nothing but a satchel and desperate hope. "It's more than I ever dreamed possible. We'll need to work harder than ever," Keith warned. "Every penny will go back into the ranch for years." "The children will learn the value of work," Martha said, "and they'll have a legacy to inherit someday." Keith's arm tightened around her. "Thomas will make a fine rancher." Martha looked up at him, her heart full. "Yes, he will, because he has the best teacher a boy could ask for." The following Sunday, the Collins family attended church in Fort Benton as they did each week. The town had grown over the years, but still retained its frontier character despite the increasing influence of the railroad. After the service, they visited Martha's old cabin, now occupied by a young schoolteacher. "Remember when we brought Thomas home here?" Keith asked as they walked back toward their wagon. "He was so small." "And you brought him that wooden horse," Martha recalled with a smile. "He still has it." Thomas, walking ahead with Rebecca, turned at the mention of his name. "What about me?" "Just remembering when you were a baby," Martha explained, "in our little cabin in town. Thomas rolled his eyes with the practiced exasperation of an 8-year-old. "I wasn't really a baby. I was almost one," Keith chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "You'll always be my boy, no matter how big you get." Thomas ducked away from the affectionate gesture, though not before Martha caught the pleased smile on his face. Her son was growing up, but the bond between him and Keith remained unshakable. As they passed the general store, a well-dressed stranger emerged, nearly colliding with Thomas. The man steadied himself, apologizing absently before his gaze fell on Martha. He froze, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Martha? Martha Lawson." Martha felt as though she'd been doused in ice water. She knew that voice, though she hadn't heard it in 9 years. Edward Blackburn stood before her, older but unmistakable, his handsome features hardened by time and what appeared to be hard living. Keith was instantly at her side, his protective presence a comfort as Martha struggled to find her voice. "It's Martha Collins now," she finally managed, gesturing to Keith. "My husband." Edward's gaze moved from Martha to Keith, then to Thomas and Rebecca, who had drifted back to their parents' sides, sensing the tension. "I see," he said, his voice tight. "You've done well for yourself." Martha felt Thomas press against her side, his dark eyes so like Edward's moving curiously between the adults. She placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "What brings you to Fort Benton, Mr. Blackburn?" Keith asked, his tone civil but cool. "Business," Edward replied vaguely. "Investments in the territory I never expected." His gaze returned to Thomas, lingering with an intensity that made Martha's heart race with fear. Keith's hand found the small of Martha's back, a subtle reminder of his presence, his support. "Well, we won't keep you from your business." "Good day, Mr. Blackburn." He began to guide his family toward their wagon, but Edward's voice stopped them. "Wait." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "The boy he must be." "What? 8?" Martha felt sick, her worst fear materializing in front of her. She had always known this day might come, had prepared for it in her mind, but the reality was far worse than she had imagined. Thomas looked up at her, confusion evident in his expression. "Mama!" Before Martha could respond, Keith moved subtly, placing himself between Thomas and Edward. "My son is indeed 8, he said, emphasis on the word my. "A fine age. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to be getting back to our ranch." Edward's expression hardened, his gaze moving from Keith to Martha. "I think we have matters to discuss, Martha, privately." "There's nothing to discuss," Martha said firmly, finding her courage. "My family is leaving now." She took Thomas's hand, nodding for Keith to take Rebecca. As they walked away, she could feel Edward's eyes boring into her back, but she didn't turn around. The ride back to the Diamond D was tense, the children picking up on their parents' mood despite efforts to appear normal. As soon as they arrived home, Keith asked one of the ranch hands to take the children to see a new litter of kittens in the barn, giving him and Martha a chance to talk privately. "He knows," Martha said as soon as they were alone in their cabin. "Edward knows Thomas is his." Keith paced the small living room, his expression troubled. "Maybe, but he's had no interest for 8 years. Why now?" "I don't know," Martha admitted. "But you saw how he looked at Thomas. I'm afraid, Keith. What if he tries to take him from us?" Keith stopped pacing, coming to kneel in front of where Martha sat. "Listen to me. No one is taking our son anywhere. Thomas is a Collins. He's my boy in every way that matters, and no court in this territory would say otherwise." Martha wanted to believe him, but fear had taken root in her heart. "Edward comes from money, from influence. If he decided to press the issue, then we'll fight," Keith said simply. "Together, like we've faced everything else." That night, after the children were asleep, Martha sat at the kitchen table with the memory book she had kept for Thomas since his birth. Every milestone, every precious moment carefully recorded. And on the inside cover, a letter she had written years ago but never expected to share the truth about his birth, about Edward, about how Keith had become his father in all the ways that mattered. "You think we should tell him?" she asked Keith softly, "before Edward has a chance to?" Keith sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "He's still young, Martha, but yes, I think it's time he knew where he came from and how much he's loved." The following evening, after Rebecca had been put to bed, Martha and Keith sat Thomas down in the living room. The boy looked between them, sensing the seriousness of the moment. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. "No, son," Keith assured him. "Not at all. We just have something important to talk to you about." Martha took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Thomas, do you remember the man we met in town yesterday, Mr. Blackburn?" Thomas nodded. "The fancy man who knew your name." "Yes." Martha glanced at Keith, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Thomas, there's something you should know about where you came from." Thomas frowned. "I came from you, Mama and Papa." "You came from me," Martha confirmed gently. "But before I met your papa, there was someone else. Mr. Blackburn. Edward was that person." Thomas's frown deepened as he tried to understand. "Was he your husband before Papa?" "No," Martha said softly. "He wasn't my husband, but he is. Well, he's the reason I had you. He's your birth father." Thomas's eyes widened, his gaze flying to Keith. "But Papa is my papa." Keith moved immediately to sit beside Thomas, putting a strong arm around the boy's shoulders. "I am your papa, Thomas. Nothing will ever change that. Being a father isn't just about whose blood you have. It's about who loves you, who raises you, who teaches you right from wrong." Thomas leaned into Keith's embrace, his eyes filling with tears. "But why didn't you tell me before?" Martha joined them, taking Thomas's small hands in hers. "Because it didn't matter. From the moment your papa and I married, you became his son in every way that counts. We didn't want to confuse you." "But now Mr. Blackburn is here," Thomas said with the perceptiveness that sometimes startled them. "And he knows I'm his, that he's my." "Your birth father," Martha supplied gently. "Yes, I think he does know." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Does this mean I have to go with him?" he finally asked, his voice small and frightened. "No," Keith said firmly. "Absolutely not. You're our son, Thomas Collins. This is your home and we are your family. Nothing and no one will change that." Thomas nodded, seeming reassured by Keith's conviction. "I don't want another papa," he said decisively. "I like the one I have." Keith pulled him into a tight hug, his eyes meeting Martha's over their son's head. The love and determination she saw there calmed the fear that had been churning in her stomach since the encounter with Edward. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As a family. The following day, Martha was not surprised when a messenger from town arrived at the ranch with a note requesting her presence at Fort Benton's only hotel. The handwriting was unmistakably Edward's, elegant and precise, as she remembered. "You're not going alone," Keith said when she showed him the note. "I have to face him sometime," Martha replied. "Better now on our terms than having him show up here." In the end, they compromised. Martha would meet Edward at the hotel's public dining room, with Keith nearby but not at the same table close enough to intervene if needed, but giving Martha the space to handle the confrontation herself. Edward was waiting when she arrived, dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the frontier town. He stood as she approached, pulling out a chair for her with the polished manners she remembered. "Thank you for coming," he said once they were seated. "I wasn't sure you would." "What do you want, Edward?" Martha asked directly. "After 9 years of silence, why appear in my life now?" Edward had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I didn't know where you'd gone," he said, "after you left Chicago. My father said it was for the best, that you'd been paid off and wouldn't trouble us again." Martha's anger flared. "Is that what he told you? I took enough money for a train ticket west and nothing more. I wasn't interested in your family's money, Edward. I just wanted to protect my child." "Our child," Edward corrected quietly. "No," Martha said firmly. "My child. And Keith's. Thomas has a father who has loved him every day of his life, who has taught him, protected him, been there for every skinned knee and every triumph. You contributed nothing but your blood." Edward's expression hardened. "I had a right to know I had a son." "You gave up that right when you accused me of lying, when you suggested I take care of the problem," Martha countered, her voice low but intense. "You made your choice 9 years ago, Edward." "I was young and scared," Edward protested. "My father was controlling and cruel," Martha finished for him. "I remember. But you were a grown man, Edward. You could have stood up to him. You could have chosen differently." Edward was silent for a long moment. "The boy looks like me," he finally said. "He has your coloring," Martha acknowledged, "but he has Keith's character, his heart, the important things." "And if I want to be part of his life," Edward challenged. "I have rights, Martha." "You have nothing," Martha replied steadily. "Thomas's birth certificate lists no father. Keith legally adopted him when we married. In the eyes of the law and in every way that matters, Thomas is a Collins." She could see the calculation in Edward's eyes, the weighing of options. "My family still has influence, Martha, resources." "And we have the truth," Martha said. "Do you really want to drag Thomas through a public fight, to force him to choose between the only father he's ever known and a stranger who abandoned his mother before he was born?" The words hit their mark. Edward's confident facade cracked, revealing the uncertainty beneath. Seeing him yesterday. He's my blood, Martha." "Blood isn't everything," Martha said, her voice softening slightly. "Thomas knows the truth now. We told him last night that Keith isn't his birth father, but that it doesn't change who his real father is in his heart. He took it well, but he's confused and a little frightened. He doesn't need more upheaval in his life." Edward looked down at his untouched coffee. "What would you have me do?" "Just walk away again." Martha considered her next words carefully. "I would have you consider what's best for Thomas, not what's best for you. If you truly care about him, you'll give him time. Maybe someday, when he's older, he'll want to know more about where he came from. But forcing yourself into his life now, threatening the security he's known his whole life, that's not love, Edward. That's selfishness." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Edward nodded, a gesture of defeat rather than agreement. "I'll be in Fort Benton another week on business," he said. If the boy would like to meet me properly before I leave, I would welcome it, but I won't force the issue." Relief washed through Martha. "I'll talk to Thomas. It will be his decision." As she stood to leave, Edward's voice stopped her. "He seems like a fine boy, Martha. You've done well by him." Martha looked back at the man she had once thought she loved, feeling not hatred but a distant pity. "We have done well by him, Edward, Keith and I together. Remember that." Keith was waiting for her outside the hotel, his face anxious until he saw her calm expression. "How did it go?" Martha took his arm, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Better than I expected. He won't fight us, I think. Not now, at least." As they walked back to their wagon, Martha recounted the conversation. "He wants to meet Thomas properly before he leaves town," she concluded. "If Thomas wants to." Keith was quiet for a moment, processing. "And what do you think?" Martha considered the question carefully. "I think it might be better for Thomas to meet him now with us present in a controlled situation. Better than having him build up a fantasy about his birth father, or worse, having Edward appear again someday when we're not prepared. Keith nodded slowly. I agree, but it has to be Thomas's choice. Absolutely, Martha said. And he needs to know that whatever he decides, we support him completely. That evening they spoke with Thomas again, explaining Edward's request in simple terms the 8-year-old could understand. Thomas listened solemnly, his dark eyes thoughtful. Would you come with me? He asked, looking first at Martha, then Keith. Both of you, of course, Keith assured him. We wouldn't let you do this alone. Thomas considered for a long moment. I want to meet him, he said finally, just to see, but he's not my papa no matter what. Keith pulled him close in a fierce hug. That's right, son. Nothing changes between us. Nothing ever could. 2 days later, the Collins family entered Fort Benton's hotel dining room together. Edward was already seated at a corner table, rising as they approached. His eyes went immediately to Thomas, who pressed closer to Keith's side. Hello, Thomas, Edward said, his voice gentler than Martha had ever heard it. I'm very pleased to meet you. Thomas looked up at the man, his expression curious but wary. Hello, sir. The meeting was awkward but civil. Edward asked Thomas about school, his interests, his life at the ranch. Thomas answered politely but briefly, his discomfort evident despite his good manners. Keith remained a steady presence beside his son, occasionally adding a comment or clarification, but mostly letting Thomas navigate the conversation in his own way. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, Thomas looked up at Martha with pleading eyes. She understood immediately. I think that's enough for today, she said, rising from her chair. Thank you for understanding, Edward. Edward nodded, disappointment evident in his face but accepting the boundary. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to Thomas. I'd like you to have this, he said. It was mine when I was about your age. Thomas looked to Keith, who gave a slight nod of permission. The boy reached out and accepted the gift, a small silver pocket watch, simple but elegant, with an ebb engraved on the back. Thank you, sir, Thomas said politely, tucking the watch into his pocket. As they prepared to leave, Edward addressed Martha and Keith directly. You've raised a fine boy, he said, his voice tight with emotion. I'm grateful he's had such good care. Keith met the other man's eyes steadily. He always will, he said, not a threat but a promise. Outside, Thomas was unusually quiet on the walk to their wagon. Finally, he looked up at Keith, his expression troubled. Papa, did I do okay? Keith knelt down to Thomas's level, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. You did perfectly, son. I'm proud of you. He seems nice enough, Thomas said thoughtfully, but he doesn't feel like family. That's because he isn't, not really, Martha explained gently. Knowing someone takes time, Thomas, and being family is about more than just meeting someone. Thomas nodded, seeming relieved. Can we go home now? Absolutely, Keith said, lifting the boy onto the wagon seat. Let's go home. Edward left Fort Benton as planned at the end of the week. Before departing, he sent a letter to Martha, thanking her for allowing him to meet Thomas and acknowledging that the boy was clearly thriving in his family. He included an address in Chicago where he could be reached, should Thomas ever have questions when he's older, but made no demands or threats. Life at the Diamond D returned to normal. Thomas occasionally mentioned his birth father in the weeks that followed, asking questions about Edward's life in Chicago, why he and Martha had parted ways, whether he would visit again. Martha answered as honestly as she could while sparing her son the uglier details of that time. The pocket watch remained in a drawer in Thomas's room. Neither displayed nor discarded a connection to a part of his history that he was still too young to fully process. By the following spring, Thomas rarely spoke of Edward at all, his attention consumed by school, ranch responsibilities, and the normal adventures of boyhood. The encounter had become just another piece of his story, important but not defining. As Martha watched her son help Keith with the spring calves, his small face serious with concentration as he tried to mimic his father's skilled movements, she felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. From the darkest moment of her life had come this incredible blessing, not just Thomas himself, but the family they had built together, the love that surrounded him. Keith caught her eye across the corral, his smile warm with shared understanding. He knew what she was thinking, as he so often did. With a gentle word to Thomas, he sent the boy to fetch more rope from the barn, then crossed to where Martha stood. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Collins," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. Martha leaned against him, watching as Thomas ran toward the barn, his movements confident and sure. In this place he belonged so completely. "I was just thinking about that day at the restaurant," she said softly, "when I told you Thomas would never know his father." Keith's arm tightened around her. "And I said that you'd be him," Martha finished, turning in his embrace to look up at the man who had made that promise and kept it so completely. "You've been that and so much more, Keith Collins." "Best decision I ever made," Keith said simply, brushing a kiss against her forehead. Thomas returned from the barn, rope in hand, his face lighting up at the sight of his parents together. "Papa, look, I coiled it just like you showed me." "That's my boy," Keith said with pride, drawing Thomas into their embrace. "That's my boy." And in that moment, with her family close around her, Martha knew that some promises were meant to be kept forever, and that sometimes the greatest love stories began with the words, "Then I'll be him."